Why don't you just die already, old man? Then we'll finally get what's ours." Those words, and spat out of my own grandson's mouth, rang across the church so loud that even the choir went silent. The pastor froze mid-sentence, holding the Bible in his trembling hands, as if he wasn't sure whether to go on with the ceremony or stop everything right there. The bride's family stared, mouths open, and the groom, my only son, looked down at his shoes instead of at me. He knew what his boy had just done, but he said nothing. Nothing. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I am 61 years old, a retired history teacher, a widower, and a man who once thought dignity could never be stolen. But that afternoon, inside the First Baptist Church of Savannah, Georgia, I learned how quickly your blood can turn against you, how humiliation doesn't always come from strangers but sometimes from the people you raised to carry your name. The wedding was supposed to be the proudest day of my son David's life. He was marrying again, years after losing his first wife, my daughter-in-law, whom I loved like my own child. I had stood by him through his grief, supported him when he fell apart, and even lent him the down payment for the very house where he now lived with his fiancée. But instead of gratitude, I was rewarded with whispers behind my back, and finally, with open venom from a boy who carried my blood. Let me not get ahead of myself. That insult, that curse my grandson hurled at me was not the beginning. It was only the moment the world saw the rot I had been smelling for months. David had asked me to attend his wedding, but he didn't ask me to walk him down the aisle. He didn't ask me to give a speech or even to sit in the front row. I was seated off to the side, as though I were an inconvenient uncle rather than the man who raised him alone after his mother died when he was only 9. The bride's family filled the first rows, beaming with pride. My seat was 2 steps away from the trash can near the church wall. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that my presence was enough, that my silence would be my gift to him. I had worn my best navy suit, polished my shoes until I could see my reflection, and slipped on the silver watch my wife gave me for our 25th anniversary. That watch was the last thing she ever bought for me before cancer took her. To me, it wasn't just a watch. It was time itself, proof of everything I had endured, everything I had given. The ceremony went smoothly until the pastor asked if anyone objected. That's when my grandson, Caleb, 17 years old, tall and cocky with a fresh haircut and a smirk too big for his face, stood up and turned his back, not to the couple, but to me. His words weren't about the marriage. They were about my house. "Everyone knows Grandpa's just sitting on all that property," he said, loud enough for the whole church. "He'll die soon anyway, so what's the point of pretending we care about his blessing? He should have already signed it over to Dad, to us." The gasp that swept through the church wasn't just about the disrespect, it was about the cruelty. People who didn't even know me felt the sting of it. I sat frozen, staring at the boy I once bounced on my knee, the same boy I had driven to school every morning when my son was too tired from work, the boy I thought I'd protected. The pastor, poor man, stuttered something about respect and family, but the damage was done. My son David glanced at his fiancée, at her parents, then back at me, and he lowered his eyes, not a word to defend me, not a whisper of rebuke for his son. At that moment, I didn't say anything either. My tongue felt like stone, and my chest like it had been filled with broken glass. The silence was heavier than any words could have been, but silence, I learned, is not the same as weakness. Silence is where revenge begins to breathe. Because while they thought they had humiliated me into submission, I was already thinking of the papers I had locked in my study desk. Deeds, wills, letters my wife had written. They thought they knew what was theirs. They had no idea what I had prepared, but I had a plan that no one, not even myself, could have predicted. When the ceremony limped forward after that ugly scene, I stayed seated, clapping politely when the vows ended, smiling thinly when they kissed. My face showed nothing, but inside I was taking notes. Who looked at me with pity, who avoided my gaze, who secretly smirked. My son's new wife never once turned her eyes in my direction. At the reception, held in a rented hall decorated with roses and fairy lights, the whispers followed me. I could hear the bride's cousins talking about the angry old man. They assumed my silence meant I was too frail to respond. They had no clue that silence is just the sheath, and what it holds is sharp. David avoided me all night, dancing with his new bride, laughing with her family. Caleb strutted around the hall like he had already won, already inherited everything. He even made a show of patting me on the back once and muttering, "Don't worry, Grandpa, we'll take care of your place when you're gone." That was the second strike. The third came when I returned home after the wedding. On my porch, taped to my front door, was a note. Sloppy handwriting. No signature, but I recognized Caleb's uneven scrawl. "You don't need all that space. Be smart. Sign it over now." I sat down in my armchair that night, the silver watch ticking on my wrist, and I let the anger settle like sediment in a glass of water, not raging, not boiling, just heavy and inevitable. That's when I decided to do something they would never forgive me for. But before I tell you exactly what I planned, let me pause and ask, where are you listening from? I know many of you out there have seen betrayal in your own families, especially when property or inheritance is involved. Drop your city and state down in the comments. I'd like to know where your stories echo mine. And don't forget to subscribe, because this isn't the end of my story. It's just the opening wound. The wound would deepen the following week, when my son showed up at my house, not to apologize, but to pressure me. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, after church. I had just finished watering the garden, still in my old work boots, when he pulled up in his shiny new pickup. He stepped out with a forced smile, the kind men wear when they're about to ask you for something ugly. "Dad," he said, "Caleb didn't mean it. He's just a kid. You know how teenagers talk." But his eyes darted past me, to the porch, to the windows, to the bricks of the house as though he were already measuring them. I leaned on my cane, watching him carefully. "Did you come here to talk about your son's manners, or did you come here to talk about my property?" He swallowed, smiled wider. "We could make it easier, you know. If you put the deed in my name now, you'd still get to live here, but everything would be clear. No confusion for the future." Future, that word, from his lips, tasted like betrayal. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch so long that a mockingbird landed on the porch rail, sang, and flew away before David shifted his feet. Finally, I said, "Get off my porch, son, before you say something you can't take back." His face hardened then, the mask falling away, and I realized it wasn't just Caleb who carried that venom. It was David too. Looking back now, it was the exact second when revenge started breathing inside me. I didn't sleep that night after David left my porch. The clock ticked like a hammer in my ears, every second a reminder that my own blood had turned into scavengers, circling while I was still alive. They weren't waiting for me to die, they were pushing me toward it. I sat at my desk, pulling open the drawer where I kept the papers nobody in that church had ever seen, the deed to the house, the title to the little patch of land outside town I had inherited from my father, old savings bonds, some of them yellowing with age, and then, tucked in a folder marked with my wife's handwriting, the will we had drawn up together. My wife, Eleanor, had been smarter than me in many ways. "Don't ever assume gratitude," she once said, "especially when property is involved." She had insisted we write our wills early, even though she hated paperwork. That folder was her voice speaking from the grave, reminding me that family can either be your refuge or your ruin. The will was clear. Everything went to David, with the expectation that he would care for me in my old age. That had been written before Caleb was born, before greed had poisoned the boy's smile. At the time, I had believed David was a good man, even if flawed. But standing at my desk, I realized something chilling. David had already broken the contract. He no longer cared for me. He no longer respected me. He wanted the inheritance now, not later. And so I began to write, not with anger in my hand, but with the patience of a chess player. I drafted a new will, scribbling in longhand first. I wrote words that felt heavy as iron. Not a penny, not a brick, not a nail to those who had dishonored me. I listed charities, a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, and, this was important, a contingency plan. Because revenge isn't just denying someone what they want, it's letting them believe they already have it, and then cutting the rope just as they start to climb. Still, I didn't rush. A plan like this needs time to ferment. The next day, I went to the market downtown. Not for groceries, I didn't need much beyond bread and coffee, but for faces. People talk in markets. They complain, they gossip, they reveal. As I walked the aisles, several neighbors stopped me. "Charles, I'm sorry for what happened at the wedding," Mrs. Jenkins from the bakery said. "That boy of your son's, I don't know what's gotten into the youth these days." I nodded, offering only a tired smile. But inside, I was cataloging who had witnessed the scene. Witnesses matter. Their memories would be part of the story later, when truth needed to stand taller than lies. As I passed the butcher's counter, I caught sight of Caleb himself, swaggering in with two of his friends. He saw me, smirked, and leaned close enough for me to hear. "You'll be gone soon, Grandpa," he muttered, "and when you are, I'll be living large in your house." His friends laughed. They didn't know I had heard that sentence before in different voices, different generations. Greedy cousins fighting over land back when I was young. The cycle repeats unless someone breaks it. I went home that afternoon and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low. My cane rested beside me, the silver watch still ticking on my wrist. That's when an idea came to me, half memory, half inspiration. When Eleanor was alive, she had taught Sunday school, and she always said, "The cleverest parables are the ones where people don't realize they're the villains until the ending." That became my weapon. Not fire, not shouting, not fists. A parable, lived out in real time, with me as the patient narrator and them as the unsuspecting characters. A few days later, David called, not to apologize. No, that word seemed permanently erased from his dictionary, but to check in. He asked if I needed groceries, if the pipes were still working. His tone was sugary, fake. I could almost hear his new wife whispering in the background, reminding him to stay in my good graces. "I'm fine," I told him. "Better than fine. In fact, I've been thinking about the future." He perked up at that word, just like he had on my porch. "The future? What do you mean?" I said slowly, letting each word drip like honey. "It's time I make sure my affairs are in order. Don't want the family caught off guard." I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "That's wise, Dad. Very wise." But what he didn't know was that I had already scheduled an appointment with a lawyer. Not his lawyer, not anyone connected to him. A sharp, young woman named Alicia Sanders, who had a reputation for being both discreet and relentless. She wasn't from Savannah originally, which meant she had no ties, no gossip chains. When I met her at her office, she listened patiently as I explained the situation. I didn't dress it up. I told her about the wedding, about Caleb's words, about David's silence. Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't interrupt. Finally, she said, "Mr. Whitmore, I can make sure your estate goes exactly where you want it, and I can do it in a way that no one, absolutely no one, will see coming." That was when I smiled for the first time in days. Still, I wasn't ready to strike yet. Timing is everything. Revenge delivered too early feels like a tantrum, but revenge delivered at the perfect moment, that's justice disguised as fate. In the meantime, I let David and Caleb think they were winning. I even invited them over for Sunday dinner, cooking roast chicken and sweet potatoes the way Eleanor used to. They came, suspicious at first, then loosening up as the wine flowed. "Dad," David said halfway through the meal, "I appreciate you being so generous. After everything, it means a lot." I only smiled. Generous. That was the word he chose. Caleb, for his part, leaned back in his chair, already acting like the master of the house. He tapped his fork against the table and said, "When I bring my friends here, we're going to throw real parties, not this boring old man stuff." I laughed softly, as if amused by his teenage arrogance, but inside, I felt the steel of my resolve sharpen. I almost stopped there, almost, but what I did instead shocked even me, because that night, after they left, I opened a box in the attic that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were Eleanor's letters, written during her final illness. She had written them to David, to Caleb, even to me, knowing she might not survive. Most of them were never delivered. I had kept them hidden, partly out of grief, partly out of fear they wouldn't be appreciated. Now I realized they were the perfect weapon. Not lies, not exaggerations, just truth. Truth written in my wife's neat, careful hand. Words that revealed who cared and who didn't. And those words, when revealed at the right moment, would burn hotter than any curse ever spoken at a wedding. I sat at my kitchen table long after the plates had been stacked and the candles guttered out. The house breathed around me, the refrigerator's low hum, the faint creak of the upstairs floorboards where Eleanor used to fold quilts, the wind worrying the leaves like a nervous old dog. I took Eleanor's letters from the box and opened the first one again, reading the loops and crossings of her handwriting as if the ink could teach me how to be cruel and still be kind. She wrote about small things, how the azaleas needed pruning in March, how David's first word had sounded like music in a busted radio. She wrote about dignity, about pride, about how she wanted the house to remain a place where grandchildren could learn to make biscuits. And in the last pages, she had scrawled, with the impatience of someone who loved too fiercely and had too little time, that she wanted whatever was left to go toward the work that keeps a soul busy and honest. She named a college scholarship in her handwriting, a community center she'd admired, and, with a narrower stroke, the charities she trusted. The letters were a map of tenderness, and they were also a ledger. If I timed the reveal correctly, if I let the words fall in stages, they would do two things: justify my actions to myself, and dismantle the smug certainty that David and Caleb had of inheriting everything. People who think themselves winners are brittle. A coordinated gust will topple them. I called Alicia and asked her to come by that week. We would need time to make the legal architecture of what I planned both airtight and invisible to the casual observer. In the lawyer's office, she had been calm and efficient, At my table she brought papers and a thermos of coffee and a sense of discretion that felt like a warm blanket. I told her about Eleanor's letters and about the wedding. I told her I wanted to do more than write a new will. I wanted to arrange it so that the house would continue to be my home for the rest of my life. And yet, after I was gone, it would not become a prize to be auctioned by my own blood. An irrevocable trust, she said after I explained. You retain a life estate, top legalese for you live there until you die, and the trust controls the remainder. You can name the beneficiaries, the scholarship, charities, even a small legacy to a friend. You can also include conditions, contingencies, and protective measures so that the property can't be seized by creditors or transferred by anyone else. The word irrevocable sounded like a finality, like the last nail in a coffin, and I liked that. It meant I could act now and make it so no hungry hands could snatch later. It also gave me an edge I intended to use with care. I could create a setup that would leave David furious and exposed, and that fury would be the very mirror in which the town could see whose choices had been honorable. But there was another tool Alicia suggested that made me laugh when she said it. A letter of moral testament, not legal, not like a will, but a statement of intent and story, one written by me, honest and plain, that would be circulated to Chloe's family and kept with the trust documents. It would explain, in my voice, why I disinherited those who called for my death and why the charities mattered. She promised it would be persuasive. People trust stories their elders tell. You'll be their judge and their storyteller, Alicia said, tapping a stack of forms, and if you do it right, they'll have no framing left to hide behind. We set the trap, not with malice but with precision. Documents were signed quietly, notarized, and filed. I left a small, seemingly generous allowance for David, the kind of thing he could present publicly as we're still family, but I made sure it would not let him claim dominion over the property. The remainder of the estate, Eleanor's scholarship, and the charities she named, was formalized. A local pastor I trusted, Reverend Matthews, would hold a copy of the moral testament in his church safe until the day it needed to be read. I chose him because he had been a friend to Eleanor, and because his sense of fairness was as rooted as the oak trees by the river. As the legal work progressed, I did something else. I planted the narrative, not lies, never lies, but hints, like the first notes of a song that later resolves into a melody. I started to speak of the future in dinners and in casual neighborhoods gatherings, of how Eleanor had loved the idea of a scholarship, and how she'd always wanted the house to help seed community, not private empires. I let those who listened imagine that my intentions were generous, as if I were giving away what I could. David heard the rumors. Caleb heard the gossip. Both misread the tone as magnanimity. Both assumed it wouldn't touch what they already believed to be theirs. That was their mistake. At the same time, I was careful to appear more vulnerable than I felt. Old men are rarely believed when they strike. They must be seen as frail and gracious. Then suddenly, when the scaffolding comes down, people notice the craft. I began taking my cane to the front porch and sitting with the paper, watching the street as if I had nowhere else to be. Neighbors waved. I smiled. David would swing by on his way to the hardware store and make small talk about gutters and the weather, then leave with the impression he'd still be able to press his claim later. One evening, a month after the wedding, I invited David and Caleb over just to talk. I cooked a pot roast the way Eleanor used to, lots of onions, thyme, and patience, because food softens even hard hearts. Caleb arrived with an entourage, the same friends who had cheered him on in the church, smelling faintly of cologne and self-confidence. David came in the fashion of a man who thought he was walking into a small concession, not a tribunal. We ate. We laughed in the small, easy ways families do when the world offers them a collective drink. Then, when dessert was cleared, I unfolded Eleanor's letter that referred to David specifically, the one she'd written when he was 22 and about to leave for a summer job. It was folded small, the edges yellowed. I had never given it to him. I had kept it because I knew the day would come when truth would be necessary. David, I said, my voice steady. You remember when your mother used to tell you to always answer a question with the truth, even if it's small. She wrote you something before she got sick. I never handed it to you. He blinked. Caleb shifted in his chair, bored for the first time. Dad, what is this about? David asked, and I could see the flinch that meant entitlement might be slipping. I read the letter aloud. Eleanor's handwriting folded into the room like a gentle hand. She spoke of pride, of the hardness that can build in a man's heart after too many disappointments, and she asked David to be a man of his word. The room was quiet enough that a spoon clinking in the next room would have been sacrilegious. When I finished, I did not look at him for a long moment. Instead, I reached across and touched the silver watch on my wrist, Eleanor's last gift, and then I said, plainly, I have placed the house and the remainder of my estate into a trust. I will live here the rest of my days. After that, the property will fund the Eleanor Whitmore Scholarship and support the community center. There is a small monthly stipend for you, so no one can say I left you destitute. But as for the house itself, it will not pass into your hands. Caleb's face, which had been a study in adolescent contempt, contorted with something like disbelief, and then anger. He slapped the table with the flat of his palm. You can't do that. That's my future. That's our... His voice cracked as it hit the ceiling. David looked at me like someone seeing a long familiar map redrawn under moonlight. Dad, he began, and in that one syllable I could hear every compromise he'd made. Nostalgia traded for convenience. Loyalty sold off for a new life. Why would you do that? Why take it from us? Because you told a church to my face that I was an old man who should die, I said. Because a child of mine cursed me at my son's wedding. Because Eleanor and I sat together and decided that what we had should do more than line one family's pockets. You raised your son in our house and let him forget the meaning of respect. I did not try to be cruel. I tried to be precise. That night, they left in a curdled silence. Caleb slammed the truck door like a punctuation mark. David's jaw was set the way it had been when he was a boy and had decided to play baseball all day instead of study. He called me the next day to protest and to bargain and to threaten. Threats wrapped in the velvet of filial concern. Dad, we can work something out, he said, but the lawyer's voice had been in my ear. The paperwork had a life of its own now, irrevocable. I felt a surprising lightness after the storm passed. Part of revenge is like pruning. You cut away dead growth to let the true plant breathe. I knew this would bruise them. I knew they would call me selfish. But I also knew the other end of the story, the one in which a young man receives a scholarship, where a child learns to read in a room that wasn't bought for private profit. That vision kept me steady. There were moments, late at night, when the house settled into a sleep that was almost prayerful, when guilt came like a stray cat at the doorstep. Did I punish the wrong people? Was I brittle and mean? Eleanor's handwriting, patient and honest, answered me in memory. She would say that dignity is not barter, and that sometimes pruning is mercy. Then the town started to notice. Reverend Matthews let slip to a neighbor that the trust had been formed and that a moral testament existed. It was meant to be a whisper among honest men, but whispers in a town are like seeds on the wind. The church pews buzzed. The hardware store counter became a courtroom. Some neighbors offered quiet congratulations. Others, people whose weddings and wakes I'd attended, frowned and muttered about betrayal and the changing face of family. Caleb, for his part, began a campaign of small cruelties. He would come by and leave trash bags in my yard tied with a mocking flourish. He would underpay for the lawn care he did for me. He'd say he was saving up and show up late, flippant, then swagger off with a cigarette. But inside his swagger was a nervousness I relished. Men who are certain of the future cannot be taught humility, unless the future slides away. A week after the documents were recorded, I received a letter in the mail. It was written in a hand that trembled. My son's. I opened it at my kitchen table, the morning light touching the grain in the wood like confession. He apologized in the way men who've lost much smallness apologize, cautiously, with hedges and small pleas. He said he felt betrayed, but he also said, with raw honesty, that he understood Eleanor's view more now. There was a crack in his tone, and through it, a sliver of the boy I had once taught to ride a bike. That sliver would be my only hope, if hope was what I allowed myself. I knew I had wounded a son. I knew the wound would fester or heal depending on the choices he made next. The thing about revenge is that it forces everyone to reveal themselves. You can then choose to close the book with mercy or with a final, irreversible slam. And yet, even as I sat there reading his letter, a small, dangerous ember of curiosity glowed. What would Caleb do if he realized the house could not be his? Would he escalate? Would he try to force my hand? Would he finally see what his father had learned too late about pride and consequence? That question sat heavy in my chest. It was the kind of waiting that tasted almost like dread, but also like the last page of a good novel just before the climax. I had set the legal bones in place. I had planted the moral story. I had given them hints of generosity while removing the prize they expected. All that remained was the reveal, public, undeniable, and humane in its explanation. And I was going to make it happen in the one place that had taken their words and given them weight, the church. Reverend Matthews agreed to hold the reading of the Moral Testament after a Sunday service, giving it the gravity of ritual. I wanted it read aloud, to be heard by everyone who had seen Caleb shout in that sanctuary. I wanted it to be a mirror. When I told Alicia the plan, she sighed and smiled. The way people smile when they see an elegant solution to a thorny moral problem. "You're not choosing to wound for the sake of wound," she said. "You're choosing to make the truth unavoidable." I folded Eleanor's last letters back into the box and put them in my drawer. The watch clicked a patient tick. The house settled for the night. There was a calmness I had not known in months, as if a tide had turned and the shore would either take the wreckage or reveal a clean pebble. I almost stopped there. Almost. But there was one last detail, small and petty and entirely necessary. I left the house key where Caleb, his arrogance as loud as his truck, would find it if he snooped. It was bait and test in one. I wanted to see what kind of man he would be when he thought he had free rein. I wanted to know whether fury would turn to vandalism or to a grudging, embarrassed acceptance. That small trap would tell me more about my blood than pages ever could. The Sunday of the reading approached, and with it the pressure of that quiet anticipation. The town would be there. The pastor would read my testament. The boy who'd cursed me would be in the room. And when the words were spoken, when Eleanor's handwriting became sound, there would be no way back. Would they finally see? Would justice feel like justice instead of theft? Or would my family's anger fracture what remained of our love? The answer would come soon, and I felt both dread and an odd, steady excitement, as if at any second a long-locked door might swing open to reveal what had been sleeping behind it all along. Shall I continue with Block 4 where the church reading occurs? Reactions explode, and the first move of their retaliation begins. The morning of the service arrived gray and heavy, the kind of Savannah Sunday where the clouds hung low like damp wool and the air smelled of magnolia mixed with coming rain. I polished my shoes, buttoned the navy suit Eleanor always said made me look like a professor even outside the classroom, and strapped the silver watch on my wrist. It ticked steadily, like a reminder that time belongs to no man, and certainly not to greedy children. I walked slowly, cane in hand, toward the First Baptist Church. Each step felt ceremonial, as though I was climbing not stairs but stages of a story I had been writing silently for months. By the time I reached the church doors, people were already streaming inside. Neighbors, old friends, the curious. Savannah is a city that pretends to be private but thrives on spectacle, and everyone remembered the wedding scene. They wanted to see how it would resolve, whether the old man would bow or stand. Inside, the pews filled with murmurs. I caught whispers. "That's him, the one his grandson cursed. I heard he cut them out of the will. No, it's a scholarship. Didn't you hear?" Every word was fuel, and I kept my eyes forward. Reverend Matthews met me at the front with a solemn nod. His Bible was tucked under one arm, and in his other hand was the sealed envelope containing my moral testament. I had written it with Alicia's guidance, but the words were entirely mine. Plain, sharp, and steady. "Are you sure, Charles?" the Reverend whispered. "Once read, it can't be taken back." "I'm more sure of this than of anything I've done in 61 years, I said. The service began. Hymns were sung, prayers recited, the choir's voices rising like smoke toward the rafters. My eyes wandered to the second row, where David sat stiff beside his new wife, his tie too tight, his jaw tighter. Caleb lounged next to him, legs splayed, chewing gum with open defiance. They looked like men at a trial, not worshippers in pews, and in a way, they were. After the final hymn, Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. The congregation settled. His voice, usually warm, carried a gravity that made the church seem suddenly smaller. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather not only for worship, but sometimes for truth. Today, with Mr. Whitmore's request, I will read aloud a statement of moral testament. These are his words, not mine. They are to be heard in full. As he intended, he broke the seal. A hush fell over the church so deep I could hear the wood of the pews creak under shifting bodies. "My name is Charles Whitmore," the Reverend read, his voice steady. "I have lived in this town for 61 years, taught history to many of your children, buried a wife I loved, and tried to walk with dignity. Recently, I was cursed publicly in this very church by my own grandson, while my son stood silent. Those words were not a boy's mistake. They were the fruit of neglect and greed. They revealed to me that what I once considered inheritance had turned into temptation." A ripple moved through the pews. Some heads turned toward David and Caleb. Caleb shifted uncomfortably but kept his smirk. The Reverend continued. "My wife Eleanor left behind letters written with love, asking that our home and savings go toward what she valued most, education and community. In her memory, and in honor of her wisdom, I have placed my house and estate into an irrevocable trust. It will fund the Eleanor Whitmore Scholarship and support the community center she cherished. I will live in my home until my final day, but after that, It belongs to no single heir. It belongs to the greater good. At this, Caleb shot up in his seat. Lies, he shouted, his voice cracking with both anger and fear. He can't do that. It's not right. The Reverend paused, his eyes narrowing, but I raised a hand from my pew. Let him speak, I said. My voice carried farther than I expected, clear and calm. The town deserves to hear his heart. Caleb's fists balled. You're robbing us. You're making us a joke. You're just an old man trying to control us even from the grave. Murmurs swept the pews. Some frowned at me, others at him. David reached up to tug at Caleb's sleeve, but his own face was red, eyes flashing with a fury he was trying hard to disguise as sorrow. The Reverend resumed reading. To my son, David, I leave a monthly stipend, enough for comfort, but not conquest. To my grandson Caleb I leave no inheritance, for respect is the only wealth a man must first learn to earn. To my community I leave everything else, with the prayer that it will nurture those who still believe in work, dignity, and kindness. When the last word left the Reverend's lips, silence fell like a stone dropped in deep water. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the back pew, old Mrs. Jenkins, the baker, let out a single amen. Others joined, soft at first, then louder, until the church echoed with it. Amen, amen. David's wife grabbed his arm, whispering fiercely in his ear. He pulled away, face rigid, and stood. You've humiliated us, he said, staring at me across the pews. You've chosen strangers over blood. I stood slowly, leaning on my cane. My voice did not rise, but it carried. Blood is not thicker than respect, David. You taught your son to value property over people. You stood silent when he cursed me before God. My choice today is not against family. It is for the memory of your mother, and for the children who will carry her name in scholarships long after you and I are dust. Caleb lunged forward, trying to push past the aisle, but ushers stepped in, firm hands on his shoulders. He thrashed, shouting words I won't repeat in God's house. David finally grabbed him, dragging him out into the sunlight, their anger spilling out like floodwater. The doors slammed shut behind them. The Reverend closed the testament, placed it on the pulpit, and turned to me. Mr. Whitmore, your words have been heard. Let them stand as they are. I nodded, my chest both heavy and light. I had not enjoyed their pain, but I had needed the truth to be seen, not whispered, not hidden, but spoken in the same place I was shamed. After the service, as people filed out, some clasped my hand, others touched my shoulder. A few avoided me altogether, unwilling to choose sides, but I noticed something important. No one dismissed me anymore. I was not the frail old man sitting by the trash can at his son's wedding. I was the man who had drawn a line and explained it. That night, alone in my house, I sat in Eleanor's rocking chair on the porch. The cicadas droned, the air thick with humidity, the stars only half visible. For the first time since that cursed wedding, I breathed without bitterness choking me. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Men like David and boys like Caleb don't lick their wounds quietly. Retaliation would come. It might be legal, it might be cruel, it might even be violent. And yet, I felt ready, because now the town had heard. Now they knew the truth. Any move my son or grandson made would only confirm the greed already exposed. I thought of Eleanor then, her letters tucked safely in the drawer, her handwriting forever steady even as her body failed her. She had written, "Let dignity be the last inheritance." I whispered those words aloud, and the night seemed to listen. But life has a way of surprising you even when you think you've written the ending yourself. Because just when I believed the storm had passed, a new one began to gather, one that would test not my property, but my safety, and the very bones of my resolve. I almost stopped there, almost, but what happened next forced me to dig deeper into myself than I ever thought possible. The Sunday after the reading, Savannah was not the same. Markets buzzed with half-phrases when I walked by. The barber down on Bay Street lowered his voice when my name came up, but I could still hear. Old man had the guts to cut his son off right in church. Some admired it, some pitied it, and some condemned it. That's the way with towns. Truth isn't digested quietly. It's chewed, gossiped, and spit back in pieces. I had expected whispers. What I didn't expect was the speed with which David and Caleb began their counterattack. On Monday morning, a neighbor knocked on my door. Mrs. Jenkins, the baker. She held a flyer in her hand. "Charles," she said, her eyes apologetic, "I thought you ought to see this." It was a single sheet of paper, printed cheaply, with bold words across the top. "Whitmore betrays his family." Underneath was a mess of sentences accusing me of cruelty, of senility, of being manipulated by outsiders. It painted David as the dutiful son, Caleb as a misunderstood boy, and me as a stubborn old man who had abandoned blood for strangers. By noon, I saw more of those papers plastered on lampposts near the market, on the bulletin board at the hardware store, even tucked under windshield wipers in the church parking lot. David had decided that if he couldn't win in law, he would try to win in shame. I burned the flyer that Mrs. Jenkins handed me, watching the flames curl the edges until they crumbled to ash in my fireplace. My heart beat slow and steady, but I admit my hands trembled, not from fear, from the insult of it. They had already cursed me in church. Now they dragged my name through the streets. The next day, Caleb came to my house. Not alone. Of course not. He had 3 of his friends with him, boys in sagging jeans with laughter too sharp for their age. They leaned against their truck at the edge of my driveway, tossing beer cans into my yard like challengers. Caleb didn't knock. He shouted, "Grandpa, you like the show we're putting on? The whole town thinks you're losing your mind. You better fix this, or you'll be the joke of Savannah." His words carried through the street. Curtains twitched in neighbors' windows. Children walking home from school slowed their steps. Caleb wanted witnesses. I stepped onto the porch with my cane, the silver watch glinting in the late sun. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match his cruelty. I simply said, "Caleb, this house stood before you were born, and it will stand after you're gone. You should take your trash with you when you leave." Laughter from his friends. A beer can lobbed into the hydrangeas. Caleb spat on the ground and muttered something vile before climbing into the truck. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel as they sped off. That night, I sat in Eleanor's rocking chair again, thinking about the way vengeance unfolds. I had delivered my blow in the church. Now they were scrambling, angry and desperate. Desperation makes people foolish but also dangerous. 2 days later, the real retaliation began. A man in a suit came to my door holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as Mr. Klein, a representative of Childs & Associates, a law firm out of Atlanta. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "your son has filed a petition questioning your competency. He claims you're not of sound mind and therefore incapable of making binding legal decisions about your estate." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Do I look unsound to you, Mr. Klein?" He hesitated. "Sir, I'm not here to judge, only to inform. There will be a hearing in a few weeks. Be prepared." As he left, I closed the door and let the laugh die in my throat. It wasn't funny. This was war. My own son was dragging me into court to have me declared incompetent. If he won, all my careful planning, the trust, the scholarship, everything would unravel. But I had anticipated this. Alicia had warned me. "When you cut off greedy heirs," she said, "the first thing they reach for is the weapon of incompetence. They'll try to paint you as senile. That's why we build airtight documents, and why you keep a record of everything." So I pulled out my notebook, a thick leather journal I had kept since Eleanor died. Every day, I wrote in it. Reflections, observations, even the weather. It was part therapy, part history. But now, it was evidence. A man who writes with clarity every day is not a man losing his mind. At the next meeting with Alicia, she was calm, as always. "We'll request medical evaluations," she said. "Independent ones, not the kind your son tries to stack. And we'll bring character witnesses. You've lived with dignity in this town for decades, Charles. Believe me, that counts." I nodded, but I also knew David wouldn't stop at the courthouse. Sure enough, a week later I found my garden vandalized, roses trampled, the bird bath smashed, the fence spray-painted with a word I won't repeat. I recognized the sloppy scrawl, Caleb's. Neighbors saw it. Some offered to help clean, but I refused. I left the vandalism visible for days. Why? Because revenge isn't always striking back. Sometimes it's letting the guilty convict themselves. Every passerby who saw my ruined garden thought less of Caleb, not me. Every whisper grew, and the narrative shifted. Maybe the old man wasn't crazy. Maybe the grandson was just rotten. Still, the tension wore on me. Nights grew longer. The house felt heavier. I wondered if Eleanor would approve of how far I had gone. Her letters gave me strength, but they also haunted me. She had written about dignity, not spite. Was I walking her path, or had I forged a darker one? One evening, I attended Bible study at church. I hadn't gone in weeks, afraid of whispers, but when I walked in, half the room nodded respectfully. Some avoided my gaze, yes, but others came forward. "Charles, come," said Reverend Matthews. "You've done what many of us only dream of, standing for principle, even against family. Don't doubt yourself." Those words steadied me. I realized then that my revenge had already rippled farther than my own family. Others in that church, in that town, were watching, weighing their own choices against mine. Dignity can be contagious, but David wasn't done. A few days later, I received a letter, not from him, but from his lawyer. It claimed that Caleb had emotional distress from my decision, that my actions had publicly humiliated him, and that damages might be sought. Imagine that. The boy who cursed me in church, who destroyed my garden, who spread flyers, now claimed he was the victim. I read the letter twice, then placed it neatly in the fireplace and lit a match. Flames licked the paper until it curled into ash. Some battles don't deserve a courtroom. Still, I prepared. Alicia gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed Caleb's outbursts, from Mrs. Jenkins who had seen the flyers, from the pastor who had heard the words spoken in church. Piece by piece, we built a wall of truth. The competency hearing loomed. I knew the courthouse would be packed. Savannah loves nothing more than a spectacle with family at its center, and this would be a spectacle indeed. A son trying to declare his father incompetent in front of the very community that had seen both our lives unfold. But I had one more card to play, one final stroke that would not just defend me, but dismantle David's standing entirely. It was another of Eleanor's letters, one I had not shown yet, not even to Alicia. In it, she wrote directly about Caleb, a boy she had known only briefly before her illness. She described him as bright but in need of a father's discipline. She pleaded with David to teach his son humility, to remind him that family is not about inheritance, but about respect. If that letter was read in court, it would slice through David's argument like a blade, because it wasn't just me saying Caleb had turned rotten, it was Eleanor, years ago, predicting what would happen if David failed as a father. And fail, he had. I folded that letter carefully, placed it in my breast pocket, and waited. The night before the hearing, I stood on my porch, the cicadas buzzing, the street quiet. I thought about the boy Caleb used to be, running across this very yard chasing fireflies, laughing when I lifted him onto my shoulders. Somewhere along the way, greed had poisoned that laughter. Somewhere along the way, David had lost the strength to correct him. I almost pitied them. Almost. But then I remembered the words shouted in church. Why don't you just die already, old man? And the pity died too. The courthouse would decide the next chapter, and I intended to make sure the story ended not with me in chains of incompetence, but with my son and grandson exposed before the same community they had tried to manipulate. Looking back now, I realized that was the night I stopped simply defending myself. That was the night I embraced the truth. Revenge wasn't just about property, it was about teaching them, and everyone watching, that dignity cannot be stolen, only surrendered, and I was done surrendering. The courthouse in Savannah sits like an old sentinel on Oglethorpe Avenue, its white columns stained faintly by time, its steps worn smooth by decades of shoes, criminals, lawyers, families clutching papers that decided their futures. That morning, as I climbed those steps with my cane in one hand and Eleanor's final letter tucked in my breast pocket, I felt the weight of 61 years pressing against me, and yet, I also felt a kind of lightness, because no matter how the day went, I knew I had already chosen dignity over silence. Inside, the courtroom buzzed. It wasn't just lawyers and clerks. The benches were filled with neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers who had heard the rumors. Savannah loves a family drama more than it loves its azaleas, and here was a father and son at war over the most intimate of treasures, legacy. David sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him, his new wife perched behind, her lips pressed thin, her eyes sharp. Caleb was there too, leaning back in his seat, chewing gum until the bailiff barked at him to spit it out. He looked at me across the room with open contempt, but I noticed something else beneath it. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when a boy realizes his arrogance has led him too far into deep water. My lawyer, Alicia, sat beside me, calm as stone. She had a stack of documents at her elbow and that quiet fire in her eyes that made me trust her. She whispered, "We're ready." I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could ever be truly ready to face their own son in court. The judge entered, an older man, stern but fair, a lifelong Savannah resident who knew both my family name and my reputation. The room rose, then settled as he took his seat. Case of Whitmore v. Whitmore, the clerk called. Petition for declaration of incompetency. David's lawyer stood first, buttoning his suit jacket. He was slick, practiced, the kind of man who made a living by twisting truth into convenient shapes. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because a once respected man, Mr. Charles Whitmore, has unfortunately fallen into the clutches of confusion and decline. His recent decisions regarding his estate are not rational. They are the product of diminished capacity, manipulated by outside influences. My client, his son David Whitmore, simply wishes to protect his father and preserve the family legacy from being squandered. Whispers rippled through the benches. I sat still, my hands folded over my cane, my silver watch ticking against my wrist. I could feel Eleanor in that tick, reminding me to be patient. Alicia rose next, her voice sharp and clear. Your Honor, the truth is simpler than opposing counsel would like you to believe. Mr. Whitmore is of sound mind, as we will prove with testimony and evidence. His decisions were deliberate, documented, and rooted in values shared with his late wife. This petition is not about protection. It is about greed. It is about a son who stood silent when his own child cursed his father in church, and who now seeks to undo his father's lawful choices for personal gain. The judge's eyes flickered, just slightly, at that last phrase. He knew the story. Everyone in Savannah knew the story. The hearing began. David took the stand first. He spoke with the polish of a man who had rehearsed every line. I only want what's best for my father, he said, his voice dripping with false sorrow. He's been isolated. He's been confused. He makes rash decisions. He's rewriting his will in ways that don't make sense. I worry he's being taken advantage of. Alicia cross-examined, and her questions cut like scalpels. Mr. Whitmore, did you or did you not allow your son to publicly curse your father during your wedding ceremony? David shifted in his seat. He's just a teenager. Yes or no, Mr. Whitmore? Yes. Did you stop him? No. Did you, in fact, look away while it happened? His jaw tightened. Yes. Murmurs filled the courtroom. When Caleb took the stand, his arrogance nearly did my work for me. He rolled his eyes, slouched in the chair, and when asked why he shouted at me in church, he shrugged. Because it's true. He's old. He's sitting on property he doesn't need. Why shouldn't it go to us now? Gasps from the benches. Even the judge leaned back slightly, his eyebrows raised. Alicia didn't even bother much with him. She let his own words sink into the room, let the ugliness of them hang in the air like smoke. Finally, it was my turn. I rose slowly, cane in hand, and made my way to the witness stand. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I took the oath, sat, and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I said, I may walk with a cane, but my mind does not limp. I have been a teacher of history for 35 years. I can tell you the causes of every war this country has fought, the names of every president in order, the date my wife Eleanor and I were married, June 12, 1979, and the exact moment she left this earth. I can tell you the words my grandson spat at me in church, and I can tell you how my son looked away. That is not confusion. That is clarity. The room was silent. Alicia nodded at me, her eyes urging me to continue. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the folded paper, Eleanor's letter. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, not from fear, but from the weight of her voice returning. This, I said, holding it up, was written by my wife before she died. It is her handwriting, her words. She addressed it to our son David about his responsibility as a father. The judge leaned forward. Proceed. I read aloud. David, if you are reading this, I may not be here to remind you. Caleb will need discipline. He will need to learn humility, because he is bright but prideful. Do not let him grow into a man who values inheritance more than respect. Do not let property blind him to family. If you fail him in this, you will fail both him and yourself. My voice caught on the last line, but I finished it steady. Then I looked at David, whose face had gone pale, his lips pressed tight. Caleb sat frozen, for once without words. I placed the letter gently on the evidence table. Your Honor, my wife saw this long before today. She knew what was coming if my son did not do his duty. She was right, and I have acted accordingly, not out of confusion, not out of spite, but out of fidelity to her wisdom. The judge sat back, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he spoke. I have heard enough. The decision came swiftly. The petition was denied. I was declared competent. My trust documents upheld as valid and binding. The estate would remain exactly as I had arranged. The scholarship, the community center, and the modest stipend for David. The gavel struck, and with that sound, the war ended. But the aftermath, that was something else. David slumped in his chair, his new wife whispering furiously at him, her face twisted with rage. Caleb stormed out of the courtroom, shoving past spectators, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a tantrum. As for me, I stood slowly, my cane steady beneath my hand, and the room, neighbors, strangers, even those who had doubted, rose in acknowledgement. Not applause, not celebration, but something deeper, respect. I walked out into the Savannah sunlight. The weight on my chest finally lifted. The sky was bright now. The morning gloom burned away. That evening, I returned home to my quiet house, sat on the porch in Eleanor's rocking chair, and listened to the cicadas sing. The garden still bore scars from Caleb's vandalism, but I saw new shoots pushing through the soil. Life, stubborn and defiant, always finds a way back. I thought of the scholarship that would carry Eleanor's name, of the students who would walk into classrooms with books in their hands because of it. I thought of the community center, where children would learn to read beneath a roof my house had built. And I thought of the town, which had seen not just my humiliation, but my refusal to bend. Revenge had begun in silence, with me sitting in that pew, swallowing humiliation. But it had ended in clarity, not fire, not fists, not cruelty, but dignity, sharpened like a blade and wielded in full view. To those of you listening, I will say this: family can betray you deeper than strangers ever could. Property, inheritance, these things can twist blood into venom, but dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken. If you are facing your own battle, remember this: you are not too old to stand, you are not too weak to fight, and sometimes, the greatest revenge is to make the truth undeniable, so that even your enemies must live in its shadow. Looking back now, I see Eleanor's hand in all of it. Her letters were not just words on paper, they were a map out of betrayal, a compass pointing me back to dignity. She once told me, "Let dignity be the last inheritance." And now, I have. The house is still mine. The watch still ticks on my wrist, and though my son and grandson may never forgive me, I know one day, some child will walk into a college classroom on the strength of a scholarship that carries Eleanor's name, and that child will be the true heir. That is my victory, that is my revenge, and that is my peace.